Welcome to Honest Leadership. For those of you I don't know, my name is Nicole Wood. I am the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Vida. If you are new to Vida, welcome. We're so happy to have you now officially in our community. We are a leadership, career, and life coaching company based here in Chicago, but our coaches are all throughout the country. And we exist to help people love their lives, which is the meaning of our name. And it was born out of a time when Forum, my co-founder, and I were objectively not loving our lives. We were burned out consultants, really at the crossroads of being like, well, I don't see a future in this, but I have no clue what I want to do next. And for me, like any savvy, powerful businesswoman, I did what anyone in my shoes would do. And I did nothing. And I sat around and complained to my friends until I was given coaching by my employer. And that's when everything started to change. And kind of same story with Forum. She was exposed to coaching as well. And the pieces started to become more clear. And there started to be a real process and support structure to work through some of these things and figure out what to do when we grew up. And so it really transformed us so much so that we decided to start a whole business around it. We're now 7 years in business. And with that, leaders of a growing team, which is also where Honest Leadership came from. Being a leader is the hardest job I've ever had. I'm sure many of you here can relate to that, and that's why you're here. It really is a job of contradictions. It's like hold people accountable, but don't micromanage, and be really vulnerable and authentic, but make sure you're still really buttoned up and professional. And so it's impossible at times to navigate, and it's a life of fine lines and gray area. And so what Honest Leadership is all about is giving us a roadmap and a cheat sheet for that from people who have been in our shoes. We love getting there faster. We don't want to make the same mistakes if we don't have to. So we're super lucky to have guests like Natalie that are going to share their experience and help us really learn about a specific perspective that they can bring. And so I'm really pumped for this conversation today, all around building community and what that means for us as leaders and how that helps us be successful, even when it feels kind of counterintuitive to a lot of the business advice that we're given. So let's get started. Real quick, before we jump into the conversation, we'll be chatting for 40 minutes or so, but there will be plenty of time at the end for your questions. So you are welcome to drop those in the chat at any time or hold them to the end. And then also, if you stick around to the end, among her many accolades, Natalie is a published author twice. So we're going to be giving away a free copy of both of her books, which is exciting. So stick around to see if you'll be the winner of that. Okay, let's go. All right, this is my favorite, most embarrassing part where I read your bio. Natalie is an author, community builder, neuroscience nerd, and mama bear for small businesses. As one of the founders of The Rising Tide, the chief evangelist at Honeybook, and author of Built to Belong, she leads tens of thousands of independent business owners while fostering a spirit of community over competition around the world. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Oh, I'm so excited for this.
Me too. We met at a conference, I don't know, back in the fall, and instantly I was like, best friend vibes right here. Love her. Then got to hear her speak at the conference and was like, she's brilliant and so dynamic, and we need to bring her in for Honest Leadership. So I'm grateful that you're here, and I'm excited to learn more from you.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. And that was such a fun conference. And likewise, we were just immediately drawn. It was like, I don't know, moths to a flame of creativity and similar hearts. So I'm grateful for the connection and excited to connect with all of you who are here today. So thank you for tuning in. I really hope we can share some valuable insight with you.
Absolutely. Okay, so before, as we often do in coaching, before we move forward, let's dial it back a little bit. I want to hear a little bit more about how you got here and kind of what shaped you as a human being and professional. One of the things that you talk about is being from a family of science nerds. So medical professionals, literal rocket scientists. And I'm curious, especially knowing where you took your career, how that influenced what you thought you should do or what a professional path should look like.
Yeah. So I, as you said, was raised in a family full of science nerds. And yes, the rocket scientist thing is true. My grandfather was with NASA for 30 years, aeronautical engineer.
So cool.
but I just popped out different. Like from the very earliest memories that I have, I remember always sort of feeling like an oddball out in my own family. And I don't know if anyone can relate to that, whether that's in a family setting or maybe in a professional setting, maybe just in being a leader. At times you feel like, whew, I am an oddball in this scenario, or I'm different. I feel and can see that I'm different. And I felt that all from a very young age. And so as I was growing up, and, interestingly enough, I just had a conversation about college on my podcast, Independent Business, but we talked about this. I always thought I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get a good job. That is what was grilled into me from a very young age. And, I was raised by a single mom, which is also a really important part of how I became who I am, because my mom sacrificed a lot for my sister and I growing up. And so while she instilled in us like these values of education and this love of science, because she's a nurse practitioner, works at our hospital locally, she also, though, sacrificed a lot, and that added this weight of responsibility to want to
Mm.
be the best that I can to honor her sacrifices. So I don't know if anyone else out there can relate to that, but it felt very much like I had a lot of pressure. If we're summing it up, a lot of pressure to perform and to achieve and to do well. And so very vividly, I remember going through high school and, doing everything I could to be at the top of my class. I got into UPenn, went to an Ivy League school. And all the while I'm, in my high school years, in my undergraduate years, I simultaneously started to fall in love with photography. I had, got a camera and started capturing my own moments, my family moments, friend moments. Then I started getting paid to photograph. And it felt like I had a huge choice to make. I kind of hit this fork in the road, so to speak, as I approached, my junior and then senior year of college, where on one side was the path that I felt that pressure to go down, the path of, graduating. I had studied visual studies, a lot of psychology, a lot of neuroscience, philosophy of the mind, things like that. And I felt this push, like I should pursue the science. But then on the other hand, I had this thing that I absolutely loved. Photography cracked me wide open and just opened my eyes to the ability to serve people with my creativity and use something that I just found to be so fun to transform the way people saw themselves. And I was shooting weddings at the time. And so as I was in this moment, I decided to do the thing. And I took that leap and was met with a lot of love and support from my family, but also a lot of like, are you sure? You're going to graduate and become an artist, like you're going to go be a photographer. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go be a photographer. And, that really, taught me a lot. Was it a perfect smooth sailing from that moment on? Absolutely not. As anyone who, has ever started a business knows, a lot of ups and downs. It's a roller coaster, and that roller coaster happens from 9 to 5 or however long you work during the day. It's not even like a long-term roller coaster. It's like, in an 8-hour span, you can go from the highest high to the lowest low. And that's what I experienced. But I, looking back, wouldn't change a thing. I think I realized in that pivotal moment that when I chose a road less traveled, or a road that I feared would cause criticism and doubt from the people that I loved the most, and I still did it anyway, and I bet on myself in that process, it was probably one of the most important decisions I ever made in my adult life. Now, I'm still not shooting, like I'm not a photographer today. So this isn't a story where I say, this business became something massive and it's where I am now. And I'm so glad I took it for that reason. I reference it because it was one of the first moments I had to make a decision that was counter to everything I had ever been taught in my entire life. And in doing so, I bet on me, and I didn't just bet on me in the winning times. I bet on my ability to survive the losing times. And I learned more from doing that than perhaps any other safer route or route that had been prescribed to me from a young age ever could have. So I'll
Mhm.
stop there. But,
Mhm.
yeah, to the science nerds, and I popped out a creative, and I walked the science nerd path up until I graduated from Penn. And then, I decided, let's do it. Let's try to be an artist. And I took that leap.
It's it's amazing and so commendable to do that when you're right, you have so many people around you who genuinely love you, and I felt the same thing. So I actually my mom is also a nurse practitioner, my family has a lot of, um, scientists as well, and similar stability was a really big kind of, tenet that was preached, and so when I quit my job to start a company, I also heard the, like, Well, do you know how many businesses fail? Stats like a lot. And it really came from such a loving place. And so
Yes.
you want to respect and honor that. And also, I love how you said you bet on you. And I kind of felt the same where I know it's going to be hard, but I trust myself that I'll be able to figure out the ups and the downs. Now, that was the most confident, I say this all the time, the most confident I ever felt was that first day that I quit and started the business. Ever since then, when you go on that roller coaster ride, I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do? But it is worth it and it's so much fun. So can you go back to UPenn? First of all, again, shout out to our Philly folk. I'm from Philly. So I want to hear number one, what you thought of Philly, because I feel like it's a very polarizing city. People are either like, yes, cheesesteaks, history, or they're like, your fans threw a hot dog at my head. Like you pretty much get nothing in between. So I want to hear about that. And then tell me more. I believe it's the science of seeing. Is that literally
Yeah.
what you studied? Like, what does that mean?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I love Philly. I love Philadelphia. I really enjoyed my time there, and we've gone back up and visited, and it changes so much. It's such a living city. Like, yes, it's a lot of history, but there's also so much culture in each little neighborhood. And so I really loved my time in Philadelphia. And then, yes, I studied the science of seeing. So what the heck is that? And what do people do who study this? Like, what do they go on to do? So the science of seeing is understanding something very simple, and that is that we see with our mind and not with our eyes. We
Mhm.
believe, if we haven't studied it, that we're all witnessing and experiencing the same thing. But the reality is we can have the same photons that hit my retinas, that hit your retina, and yet we're experiencing entirely different worlds. It's colored by our psychology. It's colored by so many different things. It's impacted in that way. But understanding, the science of seeing is really unpacking not so much, although I will say I studied actual like photons and the neurological processes that happen from the moment light hits your retina through the optic chiasm all the way to the visual cortex in the back of your brain, and like how all that works. Yes. But one step further than that, which is really more of how our experience of seeing the world impacts who we are in it. And things like
Mm.
art, things like, marketing, things like digital manipulation. My thesis was in the psychological impact of digitally manipulated images on young women. Now, granted, that was done before filters were on your phone. So I'm dating
Mm.
myself a little bit. We were just talking Photoshop and magazines, but I studied and researched that at length. So it's all about the visual system and the psychological, aspects that go alongside it. It is nerdy. It's very nerdy. But as a photographer, I loved it because I realized as well, we can all look at a piece of art and one of us says, wow, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And another person says, is that even art? Like, are you sure that's art? I would never consider that. So I studied a lot of that. And yet also I think in that pursuit, like just learned a ton about marketing, learned a ton about how to connect people to psychology of colors. I mean, you name it, we dug in. And it's been interesting now that I've launched a couple of companies, sold a company, I'm in a different season of life. I still draw on that knowledge all the time. And even just from the lens of like, it gives me empathy as a leader in workplace scenarios where we can be in a meeting and we all see the same thing, but yet we all experience a different thing, right? Once somebody asks a question or makes a comment in a meeting, and it can be easy for us to just understand our perspective and think that's truth. But when you've studied visual studies or any type of process, involving the brain and psychology, you realize, oh no, that's not necessarily truth. What I see is not truth. It's my experience. And so that also, in and of itself has really transformed the way I approach leadership and the way I apply empathy in the pursuit of basically creating psychological safety on a team. It's never, well, that's not what happened. It's learning to understand that we all are coming into an experience, seeing things differently, even if, on a very basic level, the same photons are hitting our retinas and the same sound waves are, entering our auditory cortex.
That is fascinating. It's like why witness testimony is always like same exact experience, 10,000 different stories,
Oh,
because it is through
yes.
each person's particular filter. And then I love what you said as well about in the workplace. It's interesting, and this is an aside, but I was having a conversation with one of our clients yesterday about the impact of remote work and the
Mm,
conversation we're all having about hybrid versus remote versus in person. And one of the things we talked about was exactly that, because you get so much relayed to you in this environment where it's like, oh, I was on this call and here's what happened. Versus if a boss is there and maybe it's a junior employee, they might see a totally different side or read that situation differently. And so there is some of that missed opportunity for what gets kind of lost in translation through someone's particular filter. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so you make the bold decision to go into photography after your Ivy League education and kind of all of these things lining up to say take a more traditional path. And then you get there, you're doing really well, you're building this business, but it feels lonely as hell. Like, what parts of it felt lonely to you?
Oof. Well, you nailed it. Um, what parts of it felt lonely? The fact that every day I would wake up and sit in front of a computer and work until the sun went down and then repeat the process. Because again, you hear photography and I think everyone imagines it's like the 80-20, right? Like they imagine what they think you spend 80% of your time doing, but really you only spend 20% of your time doing the actual photography. When you run your own independent business, 80% of the time is spent doing everything else, right? All the other
Mhm.
aspects of a client flow, all the other aspects of, marketing, sales, support, finances, cash flow projections, like you name it, you're doing all those other things. And so what was really lonely about it, I think, was the actual physical isolation, coupled with the fact that, I felt very much, and I wrote about this in the book, I felt like I was sort of watching the world from a distance rather than living it. I felt like I was watching others from a distance rather than loving them up close, rather than experiencing life with them up close. Social media, observing people, on platforms like Instagram and Facebook, because that's how you run your business. You're marketing yourself on these platforms. It just felt so disconnected. And another important point to note is the competitive nature of it all. When you're in these high pressure, very, very competitive situations, that pressure just compounds and builds. So now you are alone, you feel alone, and you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. So yes, it was very, very, very overwhelming at times. And I actually, to this day, still talk with leaders all the time. And it's like, I was talking about it through a lens of entrepreneurship, but truthfully, it's any sort of leadership runs the risk of feeling lonely, right?
Mhm.
I like to believe that it shouldn't be lonely. You shouldn't feel that way. It doesn't have to be that way. But it's actually been rare that I've talked to someone either leading a team, leading a company, stepping into like their first management role, even to where they realize that kind of, oh, wait, I feel very much alone. So for me, there were a lot of factors, but those were some of the primary ones.
Yeah, I was such a great leader in my head before I was one. I had so many opinions about what my leadership should be doing and what they were doing wrong. And then it's true,
Oh my
you step
gosh.
into that role and you're like, oh, wow, this is harder than I thought. The nature of the work, again, probably in that 80-20 scenario, it's not like I can't give feedback on this deck. It's all the mushy people stuff that always throws you
Always,
off your game and is really
always.
challenging to navigate. And then it is super lonely because there you have to keep an arm's length with certain things. You can't
Right.
discuss everything either up or down. And you're responsible for people's livelihoods and their work experiences, and a lot of decisions have to get made. And so that's a tough spot to be in. And I can relate so much, both, as an entrepreneur and as a leader. So how did you then start building community, and how did you figure out how to kind of make those connections even with people who probably saw you really competitively as well?
Yeah. So essentially, it came down to a single word, and that is vulnerability. I realized that as I started to navigate these spaces alone, if I was able to open up, if I was able to share about what I was walking through and just invite somebody into the conversation and go first with vulnerability, I was always met with that reciprocal vulnerability on the other side. And so I started by just sharing, hey, look, like I feel like this is really lonely. I don't like that we all see each other as cutthroat competition. What if instead we flipped the script and we saw one another as community? What if instead we decided that we were going to support each other? We created spaces where we could come together. And yeah, we're going to compete for clients or we're going to compete in the marketplace. That is what it is. We don't have to pretend like that's not the truth. But we can choose to still put people first. We can choose to still find spaces where we can come together. And so I started doing that. I started hosting coffee meetups in my hometown. And not to ramble too long into the rising tide story, but I co-founded this community called Rising Tide, as you mentioned, and other people raised their hands to meet and said, I want to gather the way that Natalie and, her community gathers in Annapolis, which is where I'm sitting, Annapolis, Maryland on the East Coast. And it started spreading. And so we basically, from a grassroots perspective, just empowered people to start meeting up in coffee shops or on, picnic blankets and fields or in auditoriums or you name it. People just started gathering and we equipped them with the tools to do that. And it spread pretty quickly. So, Rising Tide started in Annapolis. At our peak, we had over 400 meetups happening every single month in cities around the US.
Wow.
That was prior to COVID. COVID was, for a lot of people, a community killer, which is relevant because a lot of us are struggling right now with trying to redefine what that means for us, what community looks like today in 2023. But yeah, I mean, truthfully, like there's no secret sauce to it. It was one conversation, one relationship at a time, one moment of vulnerability, one opportunity to connect with another person over and over and over again. And just showing up to the table. And again, remember, when I say vulnerability, I'm not talking about either bearing your deepest, darkest secrets. So if you're listening to this going, I have to do what? No. You don't have to do that. But I do mean vulnerability in the sense that it could backfire on you. True vulnerability is open enough, is honest enough that it welcomes attack. That's literally what it means. Like if you imagine when you're vulnerable with another human, it's like taking off your armor, right? It's like, here I am. Here's how I'm really feeling. And doing it just enough that the person on the other side feels safe to meet you where you're at, right? To meet you at that same level of connection. And in the office and managerial settings, I use that now too, where if I know I'm going to have a really tough conversation with somebody and there's an opportunity to open it in a vulnerable and honest way, it's amazing how quickly we can get to the heart of an issue, or we can kind of, am I allowed to curse a little bit? Like pull back
Please do. I'll be offended if you don't.
Like, I always worry if there are little ones in the room, I like to preface in case someone needs to quickly mute or like throw on headphones. But just like peel back all the bullshit and just get to the heart of something. And vulnerability tends to be my route to do that. And for community building, that was, when we really boiled it down, the first step, and then a ton of scaling and community building and operationalizing and all that. But, vulnerability is where it starts.
Yeah. I think that's so beautifully said, and how the kind of visual of the taking off the armor, because it's so disarming then for the other person to be able to say, who may have felt competitive or who may have been fearful, okay, now I can do it. And I'll tell you, like over the past year, I've been more open and vulnerable with my team publicly on social media in ways that I never would have felt comfortable to do in the past. And my husband's always like, are you sure you really want to share that thing? Like that's out there once you do it. And I've never regretted it, because it's not my responsibility to own how someone reacts. It's my responsibility to share what's true and real for me. And the people who also feel that inevitably then come and open up, and that's what they needed to hear to do that. And so I think that's really great and totally applies in both that like kind of public setting and among a team, where you might come in, we're all walking around feeling that imposter syndrome, and you're like, oh, this person's got it all figured out, they must just be running the show. So the second that person then shares what they're struggling with, it really builds those connections. And then I love how you're like, respect. And then just like details where we operationalized it and made it run throughout the entire country. Details.
All of that. But it also builds respect. Like I'll give some very specific examples. So I've shared a lot. I've been really public. Anyone who follows me on social, or if you listen to the podcast, things like that, I really don't hold much back. There are things I don't share, mainly like my kids. I don't share their stories, but my own stories, I share. I was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor. 5 years ago, I went through neurosurgery at UCSF and spent months recovering from brain surgery. After that, I got cleared to start fertility treatment. I had been told I wouldn't be able, most likely, to have biological kids. I shared, and I don't mean I just shared, hey, I'm going through fertility treatment. I walked people through my IVF cycle. I posted it publicly on the internet, me doing my injections. Like I publicly shared a ton. And I'll tell you something, I was really afraid to do that. I was very afraid to open up at that level. Again, this is more on the personal, less on the professional, but there's a professional tie-in. As I started sharing that part of my journey, I witnessed as person after person after person who I was working with on a professional level, we never talked about my personal life, at the end of a meeting or in a one-on-one would pull me aside and straight up say to me, I've never been able to talk to anybody about this, but, I saw you share this and it reminded me of X. And can I just share something with you? And the amount of, true relationships that were formed just by my willingness to step forward and just eliminate shame around my situation and say, this is what we're going through. I've got a lot of health stuff I'm navigating, going through IVF. I'm doing this, that, and the other. Even down to my manager at the time said to me, my wife and I went through IVF. I didn't know that. Wow, that's really personal, but said, if you ever need anything, we're here. If you ever need time, like if you need, if things don't go well on a cycle and you need time, you don't need to explain it to me. You just tell me, hey, I need to take the rest of the afternoon. I'm sure a lot of manager-employee relationships are that open, and maybe, not most of them, but maybe some of them are like my situation. But just being met with that in a moment where I was going through something, it really transformed the game. And so I share that to be like, we're, and my husband, by the way, is the same way. Anytime I go to share anything, he's like, are you sure? Because it doesn't just invite, by the way, it doesn't just invite support. Okay. Especially when we talk about something like IVF, a lot of people have opinions. I grew up in like a semi, conservative Catholic environment growing up. So needless to say, I got a lot of opinions from folks that I really loved growing up that, were very strong against what I was doing. It's not just about getting the support, but it's about, I think in my scenario, being courageous to come forward for the ones who need that reminder that they're not alone. And that can be professional vulnerability. That can be like, I've seen some people share really profound and honest things about AI. This is like a professional example, saying like, hey, I actually have some genuine concerns about AI. And they're coming forward and they're sharing things and they're getting, support and also getting attacked, but they're coming forward and saying, this is kind of vulnerably what I'm really feeling right now. And I'm going to share it. And so however you want to take it, as you think about your role as a leader, you can take it fully or with a grain of salt or as a small consideration. But what I can say is that, in my own journey, I've become more and more open and more vulnerable. And you're right. I have never regretted sharing anything about myself from a place of, and this is my rule, by the way, if you're trying to think about like, when would it apply and not, I never share from a wound. I only share from what I call a scar, meaning I feel emotionally able to talk about it. I always check my intentions. Why am I sharing about this? Is it because I need validation? In which case it's not the right reason. Is it, that I'm hurting and I need support? Okay, but there are other places I can go to do that, right? Than like public sharing, for example. But is it from a place of, I want to show up and I want to serve my community. I know that people out there could really benefit from just knowing they're not alone. Is there a learning I can take from this that I can impart on somebody else? Is there and so just again, like getting clear on the why behind the vulnerability, making sure it's in alignment with your values, making sure you're kind of checking in with yourself. But then also I would say you can start small with any level of vulnerability in cultivating community, right? Like it can be as simple as, like I said, just calling out the honest things into the open. If you're competitive with somebody, but you want to build a relationship with them, like if you both compete in the workplace, or you are an entrepreneur, they're an entrepreneur, or you hold similar roles at different companies that compete. Vulnerability can be as simple as saying, I know we are fiercely competitive. Wow. Talk about taking the armor off. Like, just be honest. I know that we are competitors, but honestly, can we for a moment, like put that at the door and just have a real honest human conversation? Because I'm struggling with this thing and I know you're the only person who can understand. You will be shocked at how the moment you step forward with that level of honesty, transparency, authenticity, and vulnerability, yes, someone could turn on you and, share whatever you say to them. And of course, but more often than not, I see an immense amount of respect and like a momentary opportunity for that true relationship to form. And that loneliness is completely obliterated by moments like that. Even if it's temporary, even if it, you don't turn into best friends or anything like that, even if that's not possible. That level of just opening the door to a conversation, like I said, one conversation, one relationship at a time, it can change the trajectory of your life, your business, your career.
Incredible. I love I love a framework. I love a gut check. So I love how you've kind of built this framework for yourself around, is this for validation? Like, what's the purpose of this? And you have this
Yeah.
series of questions. I think that's so helpful. And I want to actually steal that and create my own version of it because I think it's brilliant. One component of that, and I want to kind of shift to talking about, we talked more externally. So competitors, particularly if you're in an entrepreneurial field, more internally if you're building a team. So I want to hear your perspective on how that can benefit the organization. But in terms of the framework and filtering process, one thing I'm always cognizant of is kind of that boundary, and where you can't be best friends in the same way that you can with someone who is not on your team. So how do you think through that filtering for what you share with colleagues or direct reports? How is that different for you?
Okay, this is a great question. So first, I will say, it's important for as a leader that you have other leaders where you can be more vulnerable and open, in addition to cultivating that type of community on your team with your direct reports. So think of it a little bit like, you need people that are on your exact level that you can have that psychological safety with, to be able to share what's going on and problem solve and work through. But you are going to change how you communicate with somebody that is reporting up to you, or, is just at a different stage of their career than you would with someone who's on your level, or, that you're reporting into. Of course, you're going to take those things, you're going to take kind of considerations around that in regards to how I tackle it. So, and I'll steal some of this actually. So I wrote about this in Gutsy, my book that's coming out in August. I think vulnerability looks very different in the workplace, but one of the places where people struggle the most is around failure. We don't love failing, not at our jobs, not at initiatives, not at campaigns that we're creating. We don't love it, right? Like we run away from it. And when you're working in a team setting, whether you're the manager or you are the one actually, on the ground executing against something, when there are spaces on teams where you're not inviting vulnerability to the table, people become very afraid of failing. They become very, very afraid that it's going to cost them their job, that, they almost have to hide their failures. They have to hide the mistakes they're making. And what that does is it destroys a company and a team faster than anything else. Not the failure, by the way, the feeling that you can't. Because when people don't feel like they can fail and make mistakes and stumble and, imperfectly lead or imperfectly execute, then they don't. Or they feel this need to always be politicking and always be on guard and never showing up as their best selves, but only showing up as the palatable version of their expertise. So one of the things that we do, and that I've seen done, and I wrote about this again in my book, is cultivating spaces where we celebrate, embrace, and talk openly about failure. This is just a very tactical way to do it. But my manager, our CMO, Dan, has something that he calls the batter's box. And every single week, he basically talks about the fact, like any Major League Baseball player, any professional, who is the best in baseball, has a ridiculous number of at-bats before they even hit the ball, let alone hitting a ball that becomes a home run. The idea being you're gonna swing and miss. You're gonna swing and miss a lot. And once, he gave us ratios and I can't remember them for the life of me. All needless to say, it's a lot of swings and a lot of misses before you hit the darn ball. The point here when it comes to work is that you're going to make mistakes. And actually, it's not so much about the mistakes, but it's about feeling safe to make them, being surrounded by others who can give input and course correct, not making the same mistake twice, and being in the type of psychological safety where you feel comfortable running fast, breaking things, making the mistakes, and iterating quickly to then course correct, right? To get to the place of success. And he's created that by us every week. We talk about it. Hey, I did this test this week. It failed. It failed really, really badly. Here are the numbers. Here's kind of where I think maybe I went wrong. Does anybody have feedback? Is there anything you would do differently? You'd be shocked. People come to the table and go, actually, I'm seeing the same thing over here. Or that reminds me, I just heard about XYZ algorithmic change. Have we taken that into consideration? Suddenly, mistakes are shared amongst the collective, failures are shared amongst the collective. No one person feels like their job is on the line, and we're not making these mistakes over and over again. We are iterating, we're improving, and we're succeeding at faster rates. That's just one example. It's an initiative every week. I've seen people do pits and peaks. So Friday, at Honeybook, we've done this on the product team. where you sit around a table and you do what's the high and the low of the week. You do one professional and you do one personal. For some companies that might be too personal. They might not want to lean into the personal, but nonetheless, it's giving people that space to share not just the good, but also welcoming the bad of what's going on. And you learn a lot about your colleagues in the process, and it develops sort of a different type of culture to the environment. I'll stop there and kind of give space for however you want to go forward from there. But like, just those are some more tactical examples, but the overarching theme being you have to invite screw ups, failures, missteps, mistakes, and imperfection to the table, both as a leader and, as a team member, in order for the collective to really thrive, and to win, to truly win. It doesn't matter how things look. It matters how things are, right? Like, it doesn't matter at the end of the day if it looks like you're killing it and, like it looks like your team's killing it, looks like everybody gets along, if they don't, or if they don't feel safe to be really taking those big risks that pay off.
It doesn't matter how things look, it matters how they are. That is genius and so true. I do something similar, and a particular example jumps out where a new team member was learning a system and they were not keeping up to pace on stuff because they were so scared about making a mistake and screwing it up. And they said, "I'm so nervous, I'm gonna break it." And I was like, you will, that's fine. It's good.
Permission.
You're gonna break it. It's gonna happen.
Permission.
And then
Yep.
we can move forward from there because we'll just get it out of the way because it's gonna happen at some point.
Mhm.
I love that. One of the things I think in building community with a team, and as a leader, is you're constantly wrestling, again, back to where we started around this like life of contradictions of doing what's right, respecting people as individuals, honoring each of their needs, and then also like proving ROI and generating results. And kind of one of the fundamental beliefs I have as a leader, and in the work that we do, is that doing what's right for your people and building that community like is what's good for business, even if you can't put a metric around it. People will show up in different ways. People will step up when there's a time of need. Like, it's so hard to quantify, but I know in my like gut that is the truth. How do you think about that? And then how do you as a leader justify investing in, whether it's time to talk about your, I forget the words you use. We do like glows and grows, or what did you say?
Pits and
valleys?
peaks. Yeah. Or peaks and valleys, glows and grows.
Yeah. We've done rose and thorn, like whether it's the
Yeah.
time to create that space or something like, hey, I want us all to go do a thing together or whatever it is. How do you approach that?
Yeah. So I'm going to be really honest because this is honest leadership. I tend to always default to the qualitative. I love data. I am a nerd. I'm a science nerd. But at the end of the day, gosh, it's like Maya Angelou coming through yet again. People don't really remember what you did and they don't remember what you say, but they remember how you made them feel. And I truly believe the same is true of our cultures that we build in our companies. We may not remember what the goal was 3 quarters ago, what the KPIs were for the last initiative, but we will never forget the way our manager or our teammates made us feel when we were hustling harder than we've ever worked towards hitting those goals. So I really believe in my bones that the way things feel matters. The way people feel matters. The way, a company culture is invested in matters. Whether or not you can quantify it, I almost feel as though sometimes, and this is me doing my hot take moment here, I feel like sometimes I'm trying to figure out how to put this in, so I'm just going to put it. I'm just going to say it. Sometimes I think we use numbers as an excuse. Well, I can't measure it. So we can't do it. Can't quantify that. Quantify it for me and we'll do it. To me, there are some things that are simply impossible to quantify. Not everything, obviously, but there are things. So yes, the 30 minutes a week that you're doing, peaks and valleys or glows and grows, can I quantify the ROI of that time spent? Maybe not. But do I know that my team is better for it? Abso-freaking-lutely, I do. Do I see that we perform better when we know each other on a deeper level and we can work faster and cross-functionally? We take feedback better because we have that psychological safety. I know that I can say to somebody, hey, can I give you some critical feedback? Are you up for it right now? And they know I'm meeting them not from a place of the micromanaging, but from a place of like, I know that you have the potential to be up here and you're just one notch below it. And this is what I'd love. Like, I'd love to see, try this next time. Let's see if that transforms the outcome. You can't do that if that person already sees you as a threat, as, you know, a micromanager who doesn't trust them at their role. So I think, again, like these things, yes, they're hard to quantify, but I would challenge us as leaders to not lean on the fact that some things are hard to quantify as a reason not to do them. I think it does matter that we invest in that intangible. We invest in that qualitative, the way things feel, the qualia, like even when it can be hard for us to get a number, a metric around it. Now, that being said, I do think there are ways, you know, that over time you can start to uncover whether or not things are performing well. You know, in regards to a team, even something as simple as like, depending on the size of your team, the size of your company, like, oh gosh, I feel like it reminds me of the TikTok though. 'Cause some of y'all are like not on TikTok. I'm on TikTok and I'm on like office TikTok and I'm on corporate TikTok at times, among other TikToks that I'm on. And it's the one where it's like, you know, if like 3 employees have left in the last 3 months, it's not them, it's you. So there are ways to start to identify patterns or, you know, people not engaging at work. You see certain metrics decline when people aren't engaged versus when they are really engaged. And you talked about hybrid work, remote work, and how do we maintain, you know, sort of that engagement in this new reality? There are just a multitude of questions, you know, but I do think like you can look to some metrics, but I don't know that I'm the best one to ask around like, when do you do it? When do you not? I'm always going to err on the side of like, how are they truly feeling? Maybe pulling in surveys if you need something that's a little bit more aggregated to kind of track over time in terms of, you know, sentiment, how people feel in their role, whether they feel like they can grow or not, what their problems are that they're experiencing, what the pain points are, creating those spaces where they can really be open and honest. And then if you have enough people, you can obviously aggregate that and look at it quantitatively. But when it comes to ROI on the business bottom line, I'll just say this: teams that feel psychologically safe to work together, to fail together, they do better. Teams that have a more diverse subset of employees, people with different lived experiences, different perspectives, different insights, they do better. There are stats around that. So, you know, creating spaces where people can bring their full selves to the table at work, they can show up as themselves, they feel safe to make those mistakes. It's in the best interest, yes, of the people, but also of the company, right? It's a win-win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like we should be working to quantify it and to measure these things, but also we're then doing a little bit of metric gymnastics to prove what we already know to be true based
Yes.
on all these things we've seen. Like even the fact that rising tide, starting from this feeling you're having, and boom, it's popping up where everyone is relating to that same feeling and experience and
Yes.
craving that, like that's data in and of itself. And so sometimes we don't need like the fanciest chart
Right.
to back us up in what we know to be true about the human experience. So I think that's so important. Okay, we're getting close to time. So start thinking about questions. Feel free to start dropping them in. While you do, I want to hear a little bit about your newest book, Gutsy,
Yeah.
that's coming out soon that I've pre-ordered and I'm very excited to get. I'm obsessed with this description of it. So, Gutsy is your roadmap to a life brimming with curiosity, confidence, and fulfillment. A life where you embrace that how you feel about yourself matters more than how others feel about you. Okay, there's a lot, and we need to read the whole book to understand all of it. But tell us, like, super quick, what was the like catalyst that really inspired you to write this?
Yeah, it's simple. Failure is not the reason that most people don't achieve their dreams. It's because they never get started. And when I started to ask why they weren't getting started, especially in the business world, because remember, my job in building community with Rising Tide, and we didn't go into this too deep, but 75,000 independent businesses are a part of Rising Tide. I've driven across the country twice. On my most recent cross country drive, I hugged, now granted, gosh, this was February 2020, so this was right before the pandemic. I hugged 2,000 people. 2,000 business owners. I sat with them over a 2.5-month period, connected with them, and dug into the deepest parts of what was keeping them up at night. When people don't achieve what they've set out to achieve in their life, I'm telling you, we think it's failure. We think like, oh, well, they must not have, made it. They didn't reach their goal. Most of the time, they never even tried. So as I'm unpacking this, I was like, why is that? Why are you not going after the thing? Why are you not taking the risk? Why are you not? And it always came back to, oh, but I'm afraid of insert thing that is connected to how other people view you or what people are going to say or how they're going to perceive it. Even when people say, oh, I'm afraid of public speaking. And I say, why? It's not speaking. It's people watching. It's what they're going to think when you're on the stage, what they're going to think when you're in the meeting and you raise your hand or you open your mouth or you vocalize an opinion. The fear of what other people think of us holds us back from doing so much in our lives. And so I set out to write a book that took into consideration both the neurological aspects, like the psychology, the neurobiology, the chemicals in our brain that are connected to all of these processes around our inhibition, our what keeps us stuck, all of that. I studied it, I researched it, I pulled in a ton of data. I got nerdy with you, but also stories on how to beat it. How do you overcome it? Because it's never going away. If anyone's ever said to you, well, just stop worrying about what other people think. You can't. You can't. Your brain is wired to care about what they think. We can't separate ourselves from it in the same way we can't separate ourselves from inhaling oxygen into our lungs. It's a part of our biology. But the book is about how you navigate it. The book is about, moving forward anyway, because at the end of our lives, you're never going to hear somebody say, well, this one time in my comfort zone. Never. The ones that matter most in our lives are the ones where we break out of the comfort zone, where we dare to do the thing. And like I said, where I took an Ivy League diploma and I basically tucked it in the visor of my car and drove off in a completely different direction toward my future. And I became a photographer. And it was the best decision I ever made. And so in so many areas of our life, when we look back, my hope is that this book can help people to do just that, can help people to move past the fear of what other people think or how they're going to be judged or how it'll be perceived, and know that their opinion of themselves matters more than the opinion that others have of them and how to navigate it. So I'm excited for Gutsy. I will say Built to Belong was like a sweet bell pepper. Built to Belong is very sweet. And this is more of a habanero. Gutsy's a little bit spicier.
Well, fiery.
Yeah. Fiery with a side of science. So
I love it. I'm so excited to read it. I'm so guilty of that. I can get really caught up in other people's perceptions, in ruminating on all these stories I've made up about, I'm sure, whatever that person has thought that is completely just, again, through my filter. And so I love the premise of this book. It's also, as your point, never something that's going to go away, but something that we can work to combat and still move towards our goals anyway, which is also what coaching's about. That feeling is going to be there. We're all going to be walking this earth going, am I good enough? But how do you take those small steps? How do you change those narratives slowly over time? And that's so much of what I do with my coach. And in fact, I had a session a few days ago where I needed to make a decision that I was worried about how that would be perceived. And so if you're not a client with us yet, and this is something that's been on your mind, whether that's leadership in general, how to navigate the loneliness, the decisions, the complexities of it, we would love to support you with that. So we'll make sure we drop a link for how you can book a complimentary consultation with us, where we'll really get to know you, understand what your goals are, and pair you with the coach that's the right fit for you. Does anyone have any questions for Natalie? I know there was one that kind of came up, less of a question, more of a comment, but I want to get your take on it while others share. I'm really tempted to start out my vulnerable story sharing with, I'm not looking for validation, ... because I think people automatically go to giving you pity, even if you aren't looking for it.
Ooh, yeah. I mean, I also love, Libby, what you said here around, whatever makes you feel comfortable. Okay, so a couple things that I do, and this is less on the when I start to share vulnerably, but I like that. I like saying hey, I'm not looking for validation, or you could even say, I'm not looking for sympathy. I want to share. Absolutely. Especially if that makes you feel comfortable to take that next step. I do think sometimes a qualifier can be helpful around just helping to prepare people for what comes next. But one thing that I've learned and started to practice on the opposite side of that is when somebody does start to open up to me, especially if you do this more, where you're creating spaces where you share the wins and the losses a little more often, and especially the losses, is you can always ask on the receiving end, like, are you looking for advice, or do you want a safe space to share? So one thing, that's something that I've started to do, where if someone's saying like, hey, can I just share something with you? I'm like, absolutely. Do you want my advice on this? Or do you want me to hear, you want someone to listen? Because also that can dictate how you respond and how you further that relationship. Because then sometimes too, we'll share something that we're going through. And I don't, like, if I'm saying, oh, I'm going through infertility, for example, in a friend relationship, I'm not looking for you to tell me how to get pregnant, for example, right? Like, I don't need advice. I know how babies are made. Okay. But I might just need someone to listen. And so I think we can also preface by saying, like, I'm not looking for advice, or I'm not looking for validation from the outset, if we want, of saying like, hey, I'm not looking for advice, but I need to just share what I'm dealing with, with my team right now. And, just kind of like get it out there. Or, maybe you are looking for advice. So you can say, I'm not really looking for sympathy, or even like, knowing who else has experienced this, but I would love advice from someone who's gotten to the other side of this. Like, you can give people a roadmap for how you'd like them to respond. And it's interesting, not to circle back too far, but when we were talking about visual studies and, how each of us has a different experience with the world, so on and so forth, it also reminds me, and then you were saying like witness testimony. It reminds me back, I did a lot of research on philosophy of like asking questions, the power of asking questions, the science of asking questions. And even like social justice, where you have to be careful. Like, if you're asking somebody for their witness experience with something and you're like, what was he wearing? And suddenly now you're imagining that it was a he, for example, and it might not have been, but it can change your memory. In that same way, though, the way you construct your question or your story or what you're sharing is very important, and it can dictate the direction that it goes. So thinking about that framing around, like we've said, I'm not looking for advice, or I'm not looking for validation or sympathy. But I trust you and I want to share this with you, or the reverse too, right? Giving the framing will help to dictate the outcome. And so you can get really intentional with that and actually guide the conversation before you even begun it. If that makes any sense, like that structure is so critical. So yes, I love that idea, by the way. M. Steiner, whoever you are.
Yeah. I love that.
Right.
Context is everything. So just having that framing is really helpful. We had a question from Kirsten, who said, soon I'll have a direct report for the first time in years, just one. Is there anything different about building a team when it's just you and one person reporting to you?
Yes. So if this is is this your first one? First time in years. Okay, great. So you've done it before. That's important, because I was going to recommend some things around just preparing yourself if this is your first time. But if you've done it before and you've had a direct report in the past, at least the general scope of what it looks like to manage. But one thing I would do in this stage, especially if you hope to grow this team in the future, would be to invite that person in on creating the team culture and dynamics. This is something that we did when I was building the community team out. And at the time, it was just me and one direct report. And we hadn't known that we were going to scale at that point in time. Now the team, I think, is 5 people, and I'm not even on that team anymore, but like at the time it was just me and one other person. But I invited that person to the table of saying, hey, let's build out some of these processes together and actually co-create what the culture of this team is going to look like. And so we, dug into things on like, how's the best way to work with one another? Doing an analysis like that. How do we like to receive feedback? How do we like to give feedback? Actually working to co-create some of that so that there's ownership on the side of your direct report. They feel trusted. They feel like, you're looking to them to add value to the way you're going to work together, and they have input. And I think that's really important. But also I think, like we've talked about, it's okay to also be honest if there are sticky moments when you get into it where you're like, oh my gosh, what did we used to say? I'm trying to remember the exact language. You can just, if there are the sticky moments, like not being afraid to say, okay, as your manager, again, we're talking about like adding those qualifiers, like as your manager, I wanted to check in. Are there any bottlenecks that are holding you back from reaching XYZ goal? Is there anything I can move out of the way for you to help you achieve this faster? Positioning it in a way that can still get to the root of challenging things, but invites them to the table to take accountability. So I think that's what I would recommend, as you're building that one first person that's reporting to you and you don't have anyone else on the team. It's kind of almost like I don't know, a one-on-one all the time, right? And so I think inviting them to the table and empowering them is a good place to start.
I think that's great. And I love even how you shared like building the culture of the team with this future vision in mind. Like we're shaping this thing that's us today, but
Yep.
we know that this is going to be the foundation for something bigger. I think that's great. And it feels silly sometimes. Like I remember even when Forum and I sat down to think through our values as an organization of Amala Vida. It's the two of us in a room writing a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard, but now it's what attracts people to this company because that foundation you create then gets kind of solidified as you operate. So I love being intentional about that and inviting that person to the table. Amazing question from Jenna, especially in your early days. And I know we're coming up on time. So hopefully we'll get to everything, but if not, we'll make sure we follow up. Especially in your early days, how did you manage being vulnerable with not knowing exactly where the company was going, with the balance of employees needing a confident leader?
Oh, I love this. I absolutely love this question. I think that ultimately at the end of the day, when we look at confident leadership, we can run the risk when we think about what we would like a leader to be. Actually, like I'd even do the exercise of, if you have never done this, when I say, what is a leader? Have you ever taken the time to write that down, to actually write down what you believe a leader is, and then to think back and think about the best leaders you've ever worked with and write down why? Like, what was it about that leader that truly made them confident, that truly made them, for example, somebody that you really looked up to in the workplace? That's the work I would actually start with, because first thing I want to say is like sometimes you might attach restrictions to what it means to be a confident leader within an organization that aren't necessary for you to hold that type of position and respect within the organization. Um, some of the most respected leaders I've ever worked with have the highest levels of emotional intelligence. They're not political. They're direct and they're honest, and they don't always like I've had even my manager now, God, Dan, CMO at Honeybook, phenomenal. One of the best people I've ever worked for. And I say that knowing he'll never watch this, right? Like I'm not trying, he really is. And part of the reason that he is because he will give me critical, honest feedback. We don't always agree. We will have robust discourse, but he's fighting to see me win. He wants to see me succeed. And he's not political in his decision making on the team. He has deep emotional intelligence. But to me, that's confidence. The ability to be honest and direct, but also I feel supported and supported not being right. So and he's vulnerable. He's been vulnerable with me. Like, hey, this is really hard for me to share, but XYZ is what we're dealing with. I had to let, this person go, or, just that level of vulnerability to where even, we do something where we have our leads meetings and he'll share things with us that are coming down from the board or coming down from staff that aren't, yet publicly known. And he'll say, I'm sharing this with you in a safe space. This can't leave this room, but I trust all of you. So to me, that's confidence in trusting us as a team with certain information that'll be disseminated later to others, things like that. So outline what a leader looks like to you. Think about the leaders that you've worked with in the past who've really made an impact on you. What were the qualities you admired in them? How do you live those out? And where does vulnerability fit in? That's what I would do. I would do that exercise today and start there.
Amazing. Okay, I know we're at time and people are going to have to drop. So I want to do our free book giveaway.
Oh, yeah.
Jillian, Elizabeth, are we able to pull a name?
Yes, let's get one going here. The first person, we have 2 giveaways, right?
Yes.
The first one is Leah Raphael.
Woo! Carly, please pick me.
And let's do the second raffle.
Oh,
There you go. Kate. I believe it's Kate.
Okay.
Kayte.
Oh, what's that?
you. Yes, you, Kate.
Yay!
Yeah, Carly next
Amazing.
time, Victoria next time. Also,
Okay,
you
well,
can
great
pre-order the
news.
book.
I was going to say, great news. If you did not win, that's okay. We will also drop in the links and we will send this in a follow-up email as well. The link to order Built to Belong, which you can get today and delivered right to your doorstep. And then the link to pre-order Gutsy, which will be released. Remind us, Natalie, exactly when?
August 15th.
August 15th. Woo, woo.
Yeah.
So we can absolutely do that. There was one more question that we didn't get to. I know people probably have to drop at the top of the hour, which is now. Do you have a minute, Natalie, to stick around?
I could
And
do. Yeah. Yeah. I can stay for a
okay,
minute.
you
This
brought up the
message.
scar versus wound earlier in the session. What if
Yes.
one of your direct reports brings something to the table and it is a wound for you? How do you
Yeah.
approach the conversation? If you will have a personal reaction, but you still want to show support for your team.
Yeah,
Amazing.
absolutely.
Perfect example of a very complicated leadership question that a textbook's not going to tell you what to do, but why these conversations are so important.
Yep. And the first thing I will say is it's not easy. So it's not easy. I can tell you how I navigate it. So whenever I'm in, especially if it's asked in more of a public space, but more often than not, these types of things that are woundy are asked in one-on-ones, at least from my experience, where it's not kind of, a team of us sitting around, but it's like my one-on-one, with a team member. And generally, I'm just honest. I'll say something along the lines of, always start by responding with empathy to the person sharing. So ensuring they know that you hear them and that you're grateful that they shared it with you. That's where I start. So, Nicole, I am so glad that you shared with me that you're going through XYZ. And I've actually experienced that myself. And I'm at a place where, I'm still navigating it. I'm still in the midst of it. And so depending on what they're asking you, you can either at that point pivot to a couple different things. One, you can offer them a resource that's maybe helping you. So a separate third-party resource, a book, a podcast, a mentor, an example of something, and saying, this is where I'm currently, actually, I'm trying to think, I had a manager once that did this and I can't remember. It wasn't so much wound in like the deepest vulnerable sense of it, but it was something around like a personnel issue that I was having and really struggling. And I was like, I don't know how to navigate this. This is really hard. And the manager responded along the lines of, I don't have the answer for you right now because I'm also trying to figure out a similar situation on my end and how to go through it. But this is the resource I've been using that's been helpful. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can redirect to a follow-up. So if it's something that in a week or two, you'd be more open to discussing. So let's say your company is going through a difficult situation. Folks were just laid off. This is like a, fairly culturally relevant, unfortunately, example of what's happening. And someone's coming to you to vent and they're angry and they're frustrated and they're being vulnerable and they're pouring out everything, about the situation. And you may just not be in a space where A, you can say anything, or B, you're emotionally ready to say anything because people forget when you're in a leadership role, you're also going through it, right? They look to you as the leader, but they forget sometimes that like when someone's let go or if there's a layoff, like you're emotionally carrying the weight of what's happening as well. You just have to show up a little bit differently. And so you can always say like, give them their space, thank them for bringing it to you, thank them for feeling safe to share with you. But then say, we're still in the midst of this. I want to give it a couple days. Let's give it a couple days and reconvene on this. I need some time to kind of think through it, or I need some time to discuss with XYZ and XYZ how to best support the team. Thank you for sharing with me that this is how you're feeling. I want to see if other people are experiencing something similar. I'm going to be talking, like whatever it is. I would say create a space where you can like give yourself the gap you need. Whether the gap you need enables you to breathe and figure out how you would like to formulate your response, or the gap you need gives you the opportunity to connect with other people and to bring more of a solution-oriented process to the table. But if it's something more like on a personal level, like if someone comes to you and they share about a specific issue they're struggling with and it's deep, deep, deep personal and you're in it, you can always just set a boundary. Like you can just set a boundary and say it in an empathetic way. And I've had to do that a couple times. And when done in an empathetic way, it's often met with respect and understanding. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
Again, that was hard and complex and there's no straight, easy answer, but some of those are routes that I've taken in the past, or I've had people, support me in their own way in taking, and it's been helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Mary said super helpful. I agree. And I appreciate like these are the examples we need, like literally what are the words that you use in these situations. So I appreciate that you kind of laid out how you think about it and the approach and then gave the really tactical verbiage. So this has been so fun. That time flew by and there's my crappy time management. We're 6 minutes over because it was such a great conversation. So I really appreciate you, Natalie, for being here with us. Really insightful, super valuable. Congratulations on the book, on the launch of the podcast. Super excited to listen alongside your mom. Hold us both accountable. We're your biggest fans. And we will make sure that everyone has all of these resources in the follow-up email as well. But thank you so much for spending your time with us today, everyone who is here, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.